an unidentified aerial craft crashed on a ranch outside Corona, New Mexico, about 75 miles northwest of Roswell. The debris covered an area of several 100,000 square feet. It was discovered the next morning by the ranch foreman, William W. Mac Brazel. Brazel's son, Bill, described what his father found.
According to my dad, there was a bad thunderstorm the night before. The next day he was out on the ranch and he found this debris. And he picked it all up in his pickup and was talking to people, and of course there was some talk about UFOs. He was going to Roswell, and as far as I know, he got in touch with the sheriff's department. They in turn called the Air Force. Then the Air Force got with Dad and swore him to secrecy, and they came out to the ranch and picked up this debris. Wood, I call it wood, I don't know what it was. It was something like balsa wood, but it wouldn't burn, and I couldn't cut it with my knife.
Mac Brazel brought a piece of the material to his closest neighbor.
The piece he brought up looked like kind of a tan, light brown plastic is what it looked like. Because we know plastic now, back then we didn't have any plastic that I knew of. And then there was something he described as tape. He said kind of like a piece of tape that had printing on it. It wasn't writing as we knew it, and it wasn't Japanese writing, you know. It suggested maybe that it might have been a Japanese book or something. He said the writing wasn't like Japanese writing, but it was, I imagine, more like hieroglyphics or something like that, the way he described it.
Brazel brought some of the material to the sheriff's office in Roswell. While there, he spoke by phone with an announcer for KGFL radio.
So I got a call from a man who, on the ranch, now once again we're going to get into something here. I don't try to go into details about what he said to me or what I believe he said, but he was reporting some wreckage, let's call it wreckage, on his ranch. And he asked me, and he was quite I guess I could say upset. He asked me what to do about it. And I recommended that he talk to all these. After listening to some of the things he was saying, he's saying certain things which I really would ordinarily be very skeptical about. You know, when you work at a radio station or TV station, you get all sorts of calls from people, and some of them may be a little strange. So I recommended, just generally speaking here, without trying to go into a lot of details, that he go to certain authorities. And I finally got him around to, I suggested that with whatever he was talking to me about, that he contact the Roswell Army Air Force Base. As I said, they're flyers, they'll know what to do about anything that flies. And so that was the first part of how this story gets started.
Chavez County Sheriff George Wilcox sent deputies out to the Brazel Ranch to investigate.
So you read about this flying saucer incident in the newspaper. You went and talked to your father about it.
Asked him about it, and
what did he tell you?
And I asked him, do you think this is true? And he said, I don't know why Brazel would have come all the way in here and brought that stuff if it hadn't been something important, and that he didn't, that he, it had to be something that he thought was that. And he had sent deputies out to see about it.
What happened? Did he say
And he
when
sent
we sent the deputies
and
out?
he sent the deputies out. And I'm of the opinion that he sent the deputies out once, and that they saw a large blackened area, the grass, the rangeland, and that they came back because it was dark. And then when they came back, he had to wait till the next day to send them back again to find something else. And when they went back again, the Army had blocked it off and didn't let them in.
When we arrived, why, I noticed that there were jeeps and some people, you know, from the Air Force there. And, of course, I went right in with my small child, and my husband, Jay, went into the office, and he said to my father, "What's going on, George?" And he said, "Well, we've had a man come in saying that there is a flying saucer and bringing a piece of things," and said, "I don't know what it is," and said, "We're investigating it." And he said, "What was it?" And he said, "Well, it looked like burnt grass out there." But as the years went along, Mother would always say, and I also know of an article that she wrote that said, we do not, as to this day, know that whether it was a flying saucer or what, because they told my husband, Mr. Wilcox, what she would say, "Don't you say a word." So he didn't, and he was very calm about it. I mean, he just didn't say anything.
Who told him not to say a word?
The Air Force did. When they came and picked up the piece or whatever they did, she said they reprimanded him. That's what the words were in the little article she wrote.
However, there was more to the story, according to Sheriff Wilcox's granddaughter.
My grandmother was Inez Wilcox, and my grandfather was George Wilcox, who was sheriff in Roswell, New Mexico at the time of the Roswell incident.
All right. And you say you lived with your grandmother?
Yes, I lived with her, I lived with her one whole year, and I taught at the New Mexico Military Institute, and then I lived with her 3 years, and then off and on. She helps finance me and support me and she helped me go to college.
Did she ever discuss events at Roswell with you?
One evening we were watching TV, and it was on TV there was something about space. And my grandmother looked over at me and she said, "Barbara, do you believe in anything, you know, outside of the earth?" And I said, "You know I do." And she said, "Well, I have something that I would really like to tell you, but I don't want you to ever discuss this or tell anyone, because I've never told anybody." She just wrote an article one time and put flying saucer on it, and that's all she had ever written down on a piece of paper. And I said, "Fine, what do you need to tell me?" And she, you know, I thought it was going to be something completely different than what she told me. And she said, in the 40s, there was a spacecraft, a flying saucer is what Big Mom called it, crashed outside of Roswell. And I said, "That's interesting." I said, "How do you know about it, Big Mom?" And she said, "Your grandfather, George, was as a sheriff at the time." And I said, "Well, you know, I didn't have any idea." I said, "What more about it?" And she was very hesitant to talk about it, but you knew that within her there was something that she really needed to tell me. And she sat there for quite a while, and then she looked at me and she said, "I'm just going to tell you." And she said, "But don't tell anybody." And I said, "Who would I tell anyway? I don't know anybody to tell." And she said, "The reason that I'm telling you this is because when the incident happened, the military police came to the courthouse, to the jailhouse, and told George and I that if we ever told anything about this incident, talked about it in any way, that not only we would be killed, but the family, that they would get the rest of the family."
She was there and witnessed the police,
Yes,
the military come in?
Yes, when she was standing there with my grandfather. I said, "Did you hear them say that, Big Mom?" That's what I called her. And she said, "Yes, I did, Barbara." And she said, "That's exactly what they told us." And I said, "Why? What did he know?"
And did she tell you what she
Yes,
knew?
yes. I said, what could you have known? That what happened is my grandmother said that they called my grandfather. Whether they called him on the telephone, came to the office, they lived there at the courthouse.
Your grandparents?
Yes, they lived in the jailhouse,
Right.
I guess. Okay. And someone came and told my grandfather of this incident that had happened outside of Roswell. My grandmother stated that my grandfather went out there to the site. When he got out there, there was a big burned area when they first approached the area. And then they saw debris. He saw debris. I don't know if he was alone. She was not with him. He went by himself. She said that it was kind of like in the evening. And then when he came back, I asked her, I said, you know, out of jokingness, did he see any little space beings? You know? And she said, yes, there was 4 of them. And I asked her, I said, what did they have on, Big Mom? And she said that they were like gray. And Granddaddy said their heads were large. And the little suit that they had on was just, you couldn't, it was just like silk or something, like that kind of material. But they were gray. And I asked her what happened after that, and she said he came back into town, and I guess they had discussed this incident, and they had thought it was fine to put it over the news, to talk about it, and then apparently something happened, and it was not okay. And that's when he started, Big Mom said he got phone calls from all over the world. England, people were calling him, talking to him, asking him about the situation, and he had been visited. And when they knew it, he had gone out there and seen the site and seen this situation that they had talked about. Big Mom said that they were on him like you wouldn't believe. And they came into the jailhouse and told him, you don't say anything, George. And if you do, you'll die, and so will Inez and the children and those children. And I said, did you believe him? She said, what do you think? You know, when someone's telling you, and they have fear in their voice, and they're talking to you, and they're a person that you really love and you really care about. And she was honest. And she just told me this. And if she would have told me she'd killed somebody, I wouldn't tell something. You know, so that's what she said. And I believed her, and I know that she was telling the truth. And that's all she said. And I asked her, I said, were the little men alive? Were they dead? And she said, I think one of them was alive. And I said, did Granddaddy help it, or what happened? And she said, I don't know. And that was that. And that's all we talked about. She didn't tell me about anything else.
The Roswell Base Intelligence Officer, Jesse Marcel, was sent to the Brazel Ranch along with Counterintelligence Corps Officer Sheridan Cabot. There, they recovered a sizable amount of very unusual debris.
I found one piece of metal, what looked like metal anyway. It was not flexible, but it was as thin as a foil of a pack of cigarettes. It was that thin. One of my boys told me, he said, there's something unusual here. He said, I tried to make a dent in this metal. And he says, you can't bend it. You can't make a mark on it. He says, I took a sledgehammer and whammed it. I put it on the ground and whammed it. The sledgehammer bounced off of it.
Before arriving at the base, he stopped at his house and awoke his wife and son, Jesse, who was 11 years old at the time.
I want to say it was very early hours. It was either very late in the evening or very early in the morning when he came back here. And I had to waken both myself and my mother.
And why did he wake you both up?
He had something he wanted to show us. This apparently was some debris or something he brought in from the field at that time. And I understand he was on his way to the air base to deliver this, but he felt that this was unusual enough that he wanted us to see it first before he delivered it to its proper destination.
And what happened? What happened after he woke you up?
Well, he was, as I recall, very excited. And again, he said, "I want to show you something." And so I got my house coat on, as did my mother, and he had gone out to the car and brought back in some metallic debris. I believe it was in a box. I know. I don't recall whether I walked outside with him or not, but he made it seem like the 1942 Buick we had was loaded with the stuff in the back seat and in the trunk area. At any rate, he brought the material in and spread it on the kitchen floor, and in an effort to try to piece it together like a jigsaw puzzle to get some idea of the form of this. But unfortunately, there was too much of it, too finely divided to do that. There was a lot of rather thick foil-like material, kind of not a shiny aluminum, but burnished or a slate gray type of aluminum metal. There was black plastic type debris like bakelite, which was shattered. It was very brittle material. And then there were fragments of what appeared to be I-beams, relatively small, but the typical I-beam type configuration.
Anything else unusual about this particular piece of material?
Well, the most unusual part of this whole thing was what was on the I-beam, on the inner surface of the I-beam. Because as you look at it head-on, there appeared to be a type of writing on the mainframe itself. This writing was definitely a purplish violet hue. It did have an embossed appearance because you could, if I recall, you could rub your finger on it and you could tell it had texture. I don't recall seeing any lines or letters of any kind, but it was more like geometric shapes. Or, well, it's hard to describe it. It was curved geometric shapes. There might have been some triangles and circles, but it was solid.
Is it possible you might have mistaken it for Russian, Japanese, any other language?
No way.
Master Sergeant Lewis Rickett returned to the Brazel Ranch with Cabot.
Right out there, they had some stop points. They had some of the military police there, and they had a number of them scattered all around. And it looked like to me that there's something they said that had landed, and it was a little particle things lying all around. Asked Cabot, I said, what's going on? He said, well, this is what the guy said, something landed here. That's what he saw when he come out here. So they had air police scattered all the way around the perimeter, and the whole thing was down below the level of the horizon. It was just like a kind of depression it was a natural depression. It wasn't that thing didn't cause it. It did cause a little bit, but the material that we saw, it just looked like whatever it caused it was just like whatever there, it was just vaporized. It was nothing jagged, it wasn't cut, it just like it was been a big piece and was just some minor pieces. But some of them are curved, some of them are flat. I know that I walked around to the other side over the distance and up to where the at that time it was the military police, the provost marshal's office, and they had kind of a semi-guard out there allowing nobody in or out, and they gathered up that stuff as far as I can remember, and I know that it wasn't pliable, it was just as hard as it could be and just as light as a feather. And it was enough there that they put some in I don't know what kind, some kind of a weapons carrier, I think they called it, or a truck that the military had, and they put it in there, and the major took it with him. And I know that if I can recall right, I think that we had some, and that we had to box it up. It wasn't a big package at all. But I know that a plane came in, and I think I knew the pilot that was on it, because he looked at me, and I knew him, he knew me, but he just shook his head as though he didn't want me to recognize him. So he just wanted to know something about a package, and at this time, Cabot was running the whole thing, and they left. I heard various other sources that I'm not sure about, but I do know that later on, I asked Joe Worth, who was head of the 700 CIC, and whatever happened to all that metal, he said, that wish you wouldn't ask me that. He said, we sent it over to a lab and they don't know either, or something.
While Brazel was in Roswell, he was interviewed again by KGFL radio.
I don't know whether I should say this or not, but it was true. We hid out the rancher for one night.
Where were they?
Yeah.
Where?
Yes, and we did some transcriptions with him and so forth. Good old wire recorders, if you will.
Where did you hide him out?
We had him out at Mr. Whitmore's house here in town. He lived outside of the city limits on the east side.
So you were present at the actual interview?
I was not.
You were not.
I was trying to run the station at that time. The question that we ran into is the very next morning, some friendly person, probably from Clinton Anderson's office, called us from Washington and said, we understand that you have some information, and we want to assure you that if you release it on this matter, because it's not supposed to be released, it's very possible that your license could be in jeopardy, and so we suggest that you not do it. And he said, when I mean in jeopardy, like maybe 3 days.
I think the next significant thing, as far as I'm concerned, it was dark. I got a phone call again. It's Brazel. And he is saying in a very clear voice, you know, and very, very loud, well, look, this story is, you know, we haven't quite got this story right, and I don't know whether it was that night or the next night. See, that's what I'm saying. He wanted to come over and talk to me. So I said, okay, come over to the station. And that's where I said, look, you know, it's a very interesting story or something to that effect, and however, it's nothing at all like, or it's completely different from the story you told me on the phone the other day, especially about something, you know, the little, where I said to him, the little green men, and that's where he said, yeah, only they weren't green.
In the meantime, at KOAT radio in Albuquerque, Lydia Sleppy received an urgent phone call from John McBoyle, a reporter and part owner of KSWS Radio in Roswell.
And he told me he had something hot for the network. I got into it enough to know that it was a pretty big story when, if you wanted an interruption on this teletype, if you wanted the operator to stop, or you needed, you know, to feed something in, there was a signal bell that you turned on. And this bell came on and the typing came across, this is the FBI, you will immediately cease transmitting.
Brazel was kept incommunicado at the Roswell Army Air Force Base for about a week.
Mac was very secretive, and I know that he made it plain that he was not supposed to tell this and not supposed to tell that. And I think most of what he was not supposed to tell was that there was any excitement about this material. Now that's my recollection.
But Mac was pretty unhappy?
Oh, you bet. He was a man who had integrity. He definitely felt insulted and misused and disrespected.
On Tuesday, July 8th, Base Public Information Officer Walter Hout received a call from Colonel Blanchard.
Got the telephone call from Colonel Blanchard, and in essence, he told me that he had in his possession a flying saucer, or parts thereof. Gave me a little bit of idea where it came from, and ranch northwest of Roswell. Then stated that Major Marcel, Jesse Marcel, who was our base intelligence officer, was going to fly it to Fort Worth to turn it over to General Roger Ramey, who was commanding general of the 8th Air Force at that time, in Fort Worth.
And what did Colonel Blanchard want you to do?
He told me to prepare a release with basically the information that he gave me over the phone. When it was done, to take it into community and hand deliver it to the 4 news media we had in Roswell at that time, which is what I did.
Colonel Blanchard, on orders from the headquarters of the 8th Air Force in Fort Worth, had the material loaded on planes and flown out of Roswell.
The call came in one day to arrange to have B-29 ready to go as soon as possible. And of course, someone asked where to. I said, just get a crew on board and have the airplane stand by, and we're going to go to Fort Worth. And that was Colonel Blanchard's directive. At any rate, I was in that operations office, and Colonel Blanchard drove up and came in and asked, is the aircraft ready? And I and one other fellow there, who was now dead, said, yes, it's sitting right out front, ready to go. And with this, he turned, stepped out back into the hallway, and waved to some people outdoors and still sitting in the automobiles. And I suspect, trying to recall now, there were 4 or 5 or 6 people. And I'll say 5. Doesn't really matter, but they came in the front door, straight down the hallway, and right out onto the ramp to climb into the airplane. And these were the people that were carrying parts of the crashed flying saucer at that time, UFO today, that I got to see. And that was the only thing I got to see. And it was very short, very quick. Colonel Blanchard, in order to get out of their way, had backed into the doorway of the ops office. And I stepped up to him and I said, Colonel, turn sideways. I want to see too. Maybe if I hadn't said that to him, made it obvious that I was there, I would not have been shipped out 2 weeks later. So he just turned and looked at me, and he did turn sideways so that I could half step into the doorway and watch the fellows go through. And thus I saw them carrying certain pieces of these metals items. And as I've described to other people when asked, they had one piece that was, I like to say 18 by 24 inch or coffee tabletop size, brushed stainless steel in color. Maybe if you think of the common aluminum foil roll today, when you pull it out, one side's real reflective, but that's not what it was. It was like the opposite side, which is rather dull. Doesn't have great reflective power. And I've heard it mentioned now for so many times about the I-beam with the markings on it and so forth. And I actually saw that piece of I-beam being carried through and saw the markings. But it was a case of here it was and there it went. And
very quick.
That was all I got to see.
Well, we flew these pieces. They told us it was parts of the flying saucer, and we flew from Roswell to Fort Worth. And we started out. They told us we'd be going to Wright-Patterson in Ohio, and we got to Fort Worth, and they transferred them to B-25 and took them on to Wright-Patterson.
And what did you do then?
Then we returned to Roswell.
Okay. Who do you recall was on board that B-29 when you left Roswell?
Colonel Jennings was on board, and Colonel Barraclaw, Major Wunderlich, and Major Marcel was the ones up front.
Okay. And who was it who told you that these were pieces of a flying saucer?
I don't remember just who it was, but it must have been Captain Henderson.
What did you think when you heard that?
Well, it was first I'd heard of a bunch of flying saucers.
So it didn't really mean a whole lot, I guess. What was it that was actually loaded on board that you saw?
Well, we had it's just packages in wrapping paper, and one of them was triangle shaped, about 2.5 feet across the bottom. And the rest were in smaller packages, about shoebox size.
The triangle shape, is that an unusual kind of packaging?
It seemed to be.
And this was brown paper on the outside?
Right, with tape.
And did you actually load this stuff?
Yes, right.
What was your feeling when you...
Well, just like picked up an empty package.
Is that right?
Right.
Very light.
Right.
My involvement was to help load the crates of the debris onto the aircraft.
Why don't you back up a little bit from there? Were you aware of something happening?
Yes, we all became aware of it. With our people going to the hangar that was on the east side of the ramp, we were on the far west side of the ramp. Our people were going over there, and they come back and remeasure the aircraft to the inside for the capacity. Go back over there, and they were crating this stuff up. And when they...
when you say they were creating this stuff up, did you see what they were creating up?
All I saw was what they showed on TV here during your first program that I called in. It was a little piece of material, so big square. And you could crumple it up, let it out, and it would come out flat. And you could not crease it. One of the guys that was in on the crating and so forth had picked up a piece, slipped it in his pocket. And where he is now, I don't know. Now, when I spoke with you on the phone, I mentioned about a distant cousin of mine that was with the Secret Service. And during our conversation, this was back in the 70s. Trying to think of the year, but it was in the early 70s. Family reunion, and we talked at length. And I asked him, I said, where would they take something like that? He said, well, he says, most likely Los Alamos. All of our secret stuff goes to Los Alamos.
You didn't have any first-hand knowledge of this event, though?
He was there.
At Roswell?
Yes, he came as more or less a representative of President Truman.
Did you see him at Los Alamos? I mean, at Roswell?
He saw me.
But he didn't speak to you then?
No. He recognized my features to the features of the family. His daddy and my daddy were very close in relationship. I mean, they palled around all the time. But in the 70s, about 72 I think it was, when we were talking, he said he recognized me there, but he didn't want to identify himself.
With what department or agency was he with in 1947?
He was still with the Secret Service. I don't know what particular branch.
Did you discuss the specifics about what went on at Roswell with him in 72?
Well, some things. In other words, he asked what outfit I was with. And I told him, I said, the first ATU. He says, oh, you guys flew it out. And I says, flew it. And he says, yeah, plane. And I said, well, they said it. I said, we got the backyard gossip at the UFO or something of that sort. He kind of grinned. He says, yeah.
Yeah, it was July 9th, 1947, and we left Roswell with a crate, and we flew it to Fort Worth, Coswell Air Force Base in Fort Worth.
What were you told was in the crate?
Actually, when we left, we didn't know. No, we didn't know that in the crate that there was probably something classified really till we got back, and the kind of the rumors started talking around, and we did get a little flack as far as that we had taken something probably, and they were joking about it to us, but
any talk on the flight, during the flight?
No, there was no talk of anything. I I didn't really realize what it was on the way down there. Till on the way back, we realized it was something classified, you know, and that they didn't want us to talk about.
So you boarded the plane after it loaded crates?
No, we taxied out.
Okay.
No, we boarded the plane in the 393rd area. See, right off of the operations, really, and taxied down to the area where we picked up the crate, and loaded the crate there. Now, like I say, I don't remember loading that crate. I don't know whether that's on the blister back there or what, but I do remember at Fort Worth unloading the thing, and there were MPs on there. I remember the MPs.
Now you say MPs on there, you know, on the flight? Were they armed?
Yes. Had the old standard 45, you know. It was a low-level flight. It was in the summertime, and the weather, of course, you know, in the heat.
You want to climb to get up.
Yeah. See, so it was kind of funny that we didn't get to altitude, but we never got to altitude. Me being on the back, I don't think we ever got over 3,000 or 4,000 feet. So it was a low-level flight, which was unusual.
Mm-hmm.
Always went to, what, 25,000 and pressurized, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But that was not a high altitude flight.
Any one member of your crew make any comments after you returned back to Roswell, as far as considering the rumors at that time? Did anyone say anything more definite that you can recall?
One of the gunners said that Lieutenant Martucci had said that we had made history. I didn't hear it because I wasn't in the front, but one of the gunners said that that's what they had said in the front.
Mm-hmm.
And that's about all. And I do remember when we landed in Fort Worth that one of the persons that we met, say 6 or 7, whatever was there, was a classmate of Lieutenant Martucci's. And I do remember that remark because they hugged each other and, you know, and hadn't seen each other in a while, so I remember that part of it. And,
was there anything special about this classmate of Martucci's?
Was what now?
Was there anything special about this classmate of Martucci's?
Well, I didn't know it at the time, but somebody said he was an undertaker.
What do you think was in the crate?
I don't really know. Of course, the rumors was that they had debris and from the crash, and I'd buy that. You know, whether there was any bodies, I don't know. I don't have any idea. You know, because like I say, it was sealed. And we flew it there and come back. So
the daughter of Melvin Brown says her father told her in 1969 that while stationed at Roswell, he was ordered to guard a truck covered by a tarpaulin.
He always started off by saying he had to stand guard duty once outside a hangar where a crashed saucer was stored. His commanding officer came up and said, "Come on, Brownie, let's have a look inside." So they both went inside, but they didn't see anything because it was all packed up and ready to be flown to Texas the next morning. And then he would always say, and then, another time, all available men were grabbed. That's his actual words, I'm saying them now that I can remember. All available men were grabbed. They all had to go out to the desert where a crashed saucer had come down. And they all had to stand guard duty around this site. They were told to look, but not look, not to take anything in. And him and this guy next to him couldn't understand why they had these trucks with some sort of ice or something in them. Whatever they had in there, they wanted to keep cold. And they couldn't understand what was going on. They were confused. Him and this other guy had to sit on the back of this truck, sit guard duty. They both had guns. And there was something inside, and they were told not to look. They could get into a lot of trouble if they looked. So I have to smile every time I say that bit, because if somebody tells you to do that, if you get a chance, you're going to look, aren't you? And him and this other guy did look, and they lifted up the covers. And he did say that these trucks were coveralls. I don't know what he meant by that. It must have been some sort of truck with a cover. He lifted up, him and this other guy both lifted up the cover and saw, I'd say 2 bodies, but my sister remembers him as saying 3. We disagree on They saw these bodies, and they were about 4 foot tall, no more than that, maybe even less. Much larger heads than we have, slanted eyes, yellowish skin, and not so much when we were big, but when we were younger, we used to giggle like crazy at that bit. We used to, you know, my sister and I used to really giggle and say, weren't you scared, Dad? You know, weren't you scared? And he'd say, hell no. He said, no, they look nice. He said if they'd been alive, he reckoned they would have been nice. They had nice faces. And I don't know whether he said that to reassure us or not.
He never drew you a picture?
No. Although he got to that bit, the subject was changed. Then he'd say, whatever you do, don't tell anyone, you get Daddy into a lot of trouble.
It was always when he got to the bodies that he changed the subject.
Yeah, that was it. Changed. And if you pestered him, he got angry. He got most angry about it. But he did, I must say, I think he enjoyed telling the story. When he was actually telling it, it was almost as if, and I think my sisters agree with me here, it's almost as if when he actually told the story, he wished he hadn't.
At Fort Worth, Brigadier General Roger Ramey and his Chief of Staff, Colonel Thomas Dubose, displayed what they said was the material recovered on the Brazel Ranch for news photographers. Ramey said the material was a weather balloon radar target.
It was definitely not a weather balloon. And it was an aircraft. So what it could have been, I wouldn't know. I still don't know.
There's no doubt in your mind, I gather, that the balloon story was a cover story.
Absolutely none. We knew that it was a cover story, and whose idea it was, I haven't the vaguest idea, but we used that in order to assuage the curiosity of the press, because this had gotten out in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, Dallas News, and the UPI. And
well, the press release from Roswell, Blanchard's press release.
Yeah, well, yeah, there are all these pictures from Roswell. You see, all this created a lot of hubbub, and 8th Air Force headquarters had to be the guy that they're going to ask. The president, somebody along the line is going to say, who's running this show? And it comes up to the 8th Air Force, Ramey or his Chief of Staff. Somebody in there has got to know something about it.
Bill Brazel says today his father knew the debris was not from a weather balloon.
He said that's what the Air Force tried to make him believe, that it was a weather balloon. And he said, Bill, he said, it was not a weather balloon. He said, I don't know what it was. But he said it was something altogether different and much bigger.
Brazel adds that he picked up some of the debris that the military left behind.
And I was talking about it. I went into Corona and I was sitting there in a beer joint, and of course, my friends was asking me if I'd found any more or anything like this, and I said, well, I'd picked up a few scraps, about a cigar box full, and somebody, I don't know, must have informed the Air Force, because first thing I know, I have visitors, and they say they'd like to have this material. And they didn't tell me they'd confiscate it. They just said, well, like we're going to have it one way or the other, you know.
During this period, Glenn Dennis, a mortician working for the Ballard Funeral Home in Roswell, which had a contract to provide mortuary services for the base, received several phone calls from the base mortuary officer.
I got a call about around 1:15 or somewhere right after lunch, around 1:15 or 1:30, from the mortuary officer wanting to know what was the smallest size hermetically sealed casket that we had in stock or that we could get. And I think I informed him that we usually kept a 4 foot, but I could possibly get a 3/6. And I said, I mean, what do you have in mind? He said, well, this would be for future services later on, in case he said we need to know this in case something comes up in the future. And then about another hour, maybe 45 minutes later, I get a call from the same officer, and he said, I would like to know what's your preparations for bodies that might have been laying out in the elements, or he said, could you give me what's your preparation and how you would do it? And then before I could explain our procedure, before I could explain it, he said, what we're interested in, and this would probably be for future use too, he said, with your procedure, what you would have to do to the bodies that have been exposed to the elements and everything, what would your procedures do to changing the, like the chemical compounds, the tissues, the blood and all that, what would that do? Would that destroy any of it? Then let's say probably another hour, 15 minutes. I get a call, we had the only ambulance service, and I got a call on an emergency. There was an airman that was injured in a minor accident. He had a laceration in the forehead and in the nose. I think he had a fractured nose. And I took him to the base, but I didn't put him on a stretcher. He just sat up in the front seat with me. I gave him first aid, and then we just drove out to the hospital infirmary. And where I usually park the ambulance, there was 3 field ambulances, old Army ambulances there. And 2 of them, there was an MP standing right there at the back of those field ambulances. And I really never thought too much about it, because usually there's an ambulance, something back there most of the time anyway. But when I was taking the airman in, when we walked up on the ramp, I noticed the back doors of the 2 ambulances, the old field ambulances, were open, and I saw it looked like a wreckage, some type of, they might have had a plane crash or something, and I saw some wreckage in there. But what I saw looked kind of like the bottom of a canoe. It was kind of in a shape, but it looked, it reminded me, but it wasn't, let's say, over 2 feet, between 2 and maybe possibly the most of the piece, it wouldn't be over 3 feet at most.
What did it appear to be made of?
Well, what it looked like to me, it looked like I don't know if you take stainless steel and like put a torch to it, you can see how the blue, you'll get a blue or purplish tinge off it, and it kind of looked like that.
An even color?
Well, not particularly. It was kind of mottled color.
Did it exhibit gradations in color, or was it
the only thing,
one part of the
the
purplish stain? Was it lighter or darker?
Well, yeah, it looked like, it might have been in a hot flame. Some of it might look more like stainless steel, but most of it was kind of bluish, purplish tinge that I saw. But the only difference is on this outer edge, on the curve there, that it looked like that there might have been some inscription, something which I kind of thought reminded me of some Egyptian symbols or something like that. But just, it was, I was walking past, and I really never thought about this until I got back to the funeral home.
Then what happened after you saw that?
Well, then I took the airman on in and checked him into the infirmary there and turned him over to whoever was on call, the nurse there. And I have to always, when I bring him in, I'd sign a report, about funeral home ambulance, how transportation, because I'd always have to file a statement later and send back out. One particular nurse that I was pretty well acquainted with, and I was going to want to see if she was there and buy her a Coke, and we usually talked a lot, but this nurse had only been there, she'd only been commissioned like around 3 months, and she had graduated from college and taken the state boards and gotten her license, and then she went into the service and was a second lieutenant. Anyway, as I started back to see her, before I got back to the lounge, there was some examining rooms on each side of the hall. And she came out of one of the examining rooms coming across the hallway. And I noticed she had I don't know whether it was a handkerchief or a piece of gauze wad over her mouth. And then she saw me and she said, what are you doing here and how did you get in here? She said, my gosh, get out of here as soon as possible. He said, you're going to get in a lot of trouble. And I said, what the devil's going on? And she said, just get out of here. And then she disappeared, and that was it. And about that time, there was, when I got there right beside the door that she went in, there was a captain standing there. And he said, here are you? And I told him I was Glenn Dennis from the funeral home, that I brought a patient out. And he said, you wait here just a minute. And he waved at someone, and then about that time 2 MPs showed up. And where I got in trouble was I said to him, I said, looks like you had a crash. And I said, I need to go back and get preparations ready, because we usually, in the crash, we always did our identification, everything in our garages and everything. Getting the dog tags and the buddies and everything else. So I said, should I go get ready? And he said, that's when he said, you wait right here. And then 2 MPs come on and said, come on, mister, you're leaving. And,
what do you remember about him?
well, I don't remember anything about him, but the 2 MPs was taking me down the hall. They were, on each side of me. And they told me they had orders to follow me back to the funeral home. But we had gotten just, not probably over 10 or 15 feet. And then we heard this voice said, we're not through with that SOB. He said, bring him back. So I turned around, went back, and then there was this other captain, red-headed captain. I mean, he was a mean-looking number, but he was talking pretty rough. And he said, you did not see anything. There was no crash here. You don't go into town and making any rumors that you saw anything, that there was any crashes. And he said, you could get in a lot of trouble. Well, I was a little agitated, a little mad about the situation when he called me an SOB to start with. And I said, hey, look, mister, I said, I'm a civilian and you can't do a damn thing to me. And he said, oh, yes, we can, mister. He said, somebody would be picking your bones out of the sand. And he said, we can do anything to you, that we want to. And then there was a sergeant, a colored sergeant, that had a pad or something in his hand. I remembered that. And he said, he'll make real good dog food. He said he would make good dog food for our dogs. And they said, get the SOB out. And that's when I went on out and went back to the funeral home. Then the next day, I tried to call this nurse. I wanted to call her, see what was going on, because then, when someone escorts you back, which had never happened before, you knew there was something wrong. It wasn't normal procedure, you knew that. So I tried to get a hold of her, and they kept telling me that she wasn't there yet. She wasn't there, so I called maybe 3 or 4 times that morning. And about 11 o'clock, she called the funeral home and said, I understand you've been trying to get a hold of me. And she said, I'm not on duty today. But she said, I need to talk to you. And I said, fine, you want me to come to base? She said, well, let's just meet at the officers club. She was very upset. And she looked like, death warmed over. But she said, you won't believe what happened. And she said, before I talk to you, before I tell you anything, excuse me, I'm having a throat problem here, but she said, you have to give me a sacred oath that you will not ever mention my name or not. She said, you can get me in a lot of trouble. She said, what I'm going to tell you, you don't know where you got this,